Okay, so welcome folks on the call and folks in the room here. This is Brian Parkby, Thursday at the Las Vegas Remedy Users Group meeting. We have Jason Miller. Jason's a longtime developer coder, and he's going to be presenting on how to avoid hard coding Atrium Integrator connections. With that, Jason, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to allow you to share so you can present. And by the way, a big shout out to Jason. He's been incredibly invaluable here at the conference. He is our back-end support guy.
Happy to help.
Yeah, absolutely.
Share the screen. Okay, so CMDB and Atrium, something we all love, near and dear to our hearts. You know, when the conference was getting rolling, we're talking about it, and we're just kicking around sessions, and we need session ideas. Phil and I had been talking about work we've been doing recently, and I mentioned I had this aha moment recently. I wish I would have had it years ago, but over early summer or something, it finally hit me how to do this better. And I think I've been doing it the same way for years that many of us in the room and out in the community have been doing it, is we're hard coding all our connection information. So this scenario, you're using Atrium Integrator to import your data. That could be a CMDB, it could be LDAP, whatever you've built, it could be BMC stuff, your own transformations and jobs. And we use the static, we hard code our values, our connection information in the connections. And so one thing I've noticed is a lot of times when I go to create a new transformation or on a new system, the variables are there. BMC actually put them there for AR server and the port. And the first thing we do is, because we want that immediate, I want to see data, we wipe them out and put in our server name and the port. So we kind of break things right off the bat. So here's what I've done for many years. I've seen it, many customer sites, how they do it. You have your server name, you have your port, it's right there, and you can test it and you get immediate results. It's all as well. There are some challenges though. So the problems with that is when you're working on these following good practices, say you're in your dev and QA environments, you build out your spoon transformations and your jobs, and you have your hard-coded values, well, it's time to move that to production. And if you're using the same connection names, when you import that XML file from QA, that stomps on your server names. So now your production transformations are pointing to QA. Yeah, let's move on.
And a bunch of light bulbs just went off in the room. We're all like, oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and I fortunately, when I finally got in the habit for checking for that before I went down the variable route that we're talking about, I was mostly doing dev to QA, and I go, why is my QA pulling from dev? Oh, okay. So I've also seen the workaround to that. Instead of using one connection to your AR server, or if you're pulling from another database, SCCM, an external place, you have a job and then you have connections just for that job. So that way, if you made the job for ABC or connections for your job ABC, say that's an LDAP. Well, let's keep them all in SQL type realm. Say you're pulling SCCM. So you got a job to pull the computers, and you use that's ABC job, and you create connections for ABC job. And then you also have another job that's pulling in, say, monitors or something else, also from SCCM. Technically, they're going the same place, but you work on those at different intervals. They're in different development cycles. So that's job YYZ, and you create new connections because you know you'll be migrating these into production at different points, and you don't want to break your connections because you've done that before. But now you have connection sprawl. So you have all these connections, they're all coming from the same place, but this is your workaround to kind of hoping to not break it or break minimal things. Because if you took job ABC from QA to prod, you still broke that connection, but you didn't break all your other jobs. And then you go in real quick and fix it, and hopefully you caught it before the next runtime. if you remember. I have forgotten. So, but it's really, now it's a maintenance chore because you have all these connections are doing the same thing. They're going to the same place. But if the DBA team says, yeah, our SCCM database is moving from host A to host B, you've got more connections you have to go update versus one spot. This is from a real customer environment. And you can see there's a scroll bar. There's more than we can see here. Now, admittedly, some of those are thanks to BMC. This was an older version when they gave us a bunch of their testing connections. They thankfully don't do that anymore, but the customer had left those there and they continued to add. And it was just kind of out of hand, and almost none of them were being used. This was all people throwing spaghetti at the wall. I want to try something. I'll create a new connection. So let's reuse them and just make them more flexible. Now, here's where the light bulb went off. I was doing it was an LDAP job in this sense. I wanted to make the job dynamic. And I talked about this in my session on Tuesday, where the customer had 4 different organizational units where they were pulling information from, and the jobs were jobs and transformations. They had 5 OUs they needed to pull from. Those were all built as separate jobs and transformations because the OUs were hard coded. And when we got down the line of, the customer say, we want a new value from LDAP, but on all of their different types of customers or, employees, vendors, whoever they had, we had to go update 5 jobs, 5 transformations. And they also had the redundant connections. So it was just out of hand. So that's where the light bulb, I kind of lost my train of thought for a moment. I knew CMDB, Atrium Integrator could use variables. We've seen UDM variable. We know it's there. And I had many late nights trying to figure this out. How do I get my spoon job to see the variable? It's there. I know it's there. It saves data. But there was no place in the Atrium side of things to do that. Now, I could have written a transformation to go query the record and pull my variables, but I didn't want to do that. I knew BMC had a bigger idea in mind, but I just didn't know what it was. I guess I'm kind of skipping around here. All the connections that customer had, this is what we ended up with. We cleaned it all out and reused. Okay, sorry, I kind of skipping around on my own train of thoughts here. Here's an example of the variables. So I've seen them. BMC gives you these out of the box. AR_server, they give you that. I'm using exactly what they provide in some of theirs. Why reinvent the wheel? The syntax is $, open squiggly bracket, your variable name, and then close the bracket. And here's the LDAP example where I'm pulling the LDAP hosts, and the search base is the OU that was dynamic. Okay, wow, I really kind of should have given myself an outline. So before we get to actual, how do we utilize the variables in our full job? We've got spoon transformations. We need to test it because that's why we hard code the values in the first place. I want to hit the test button and I want to see it run. If we put that with a bracket, a $ bracket, variable, close the bracket, we can't test it anymore, but we can. You can set your environment variables. It has your variables. Most of the time, this will populate automatically based on the transformations and jobs you have open. Occasionally, I have to just add a new line and enter one in. For whatever reason, it didn't pick it up. Sometimes Spoon has some weird caching issues, but here's all the things that Spoon will now use these and replace my variables when I go to debug before I'm even scheduling the job in data management. I guess the other thing to say about that, the LDAP specifics example, when we first went live with that, this was still the old Atrium Integrator Flash console we were using, and we scheduled it as an Atrium job in there. And there's no concept of the variables and using it there. The aha moment was I had to come here. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with this because it's fragile. If your job errors, if you're running on a reoccurring schedule, It doesn't create the next scheduled runtime unless your job finished successfully. So if your job fails, you have to come in manually and recreate the job. You could copy it, but unless you catch that, your job's no longer running. And I hate that. I hate how fragile it is. One of these days, I'm going to break down and create a monitoring process to say, here's my schedule. Go ahead and recreate it, even though the last one failed. But this is the key. When you schedule from here, instead of in CMDB terms, the old Flash console or now the new console, you can use the variables. Why they didn't expose it throughout the process is a mystery, probably different product teams. So this is where we're going to actually give the job the information, because what we showed before in Spoon was just for testing, debugging. The server doesn't know about that, where we set up the variables. And there's the syntax again for the, to identify, define a variable. So here here's a job. I created this new RMDY LDAP import, and it automatically gets your global variables. The nice thing is I have specified the server name in here, and I guess it's good for an override, but I've also learned I don't have to. There's some magic in the background that if you leave AR server blank there at the bottom, it knows your server. Now I could send that somewhere else if I wanted to define it, but if I leave it blank, it's just going to use your server. And actually it should use your ranking, I believe. I may have to test that. But the local variables are the key to your job. These are specific to this job, not global for all your jobs. And in this case, it's an LDAP import. Now there's the default, and this kind of goes back to my presentation on Tuesday. That's a kind of a catch-all organizational unit. The two jobs I was actually running against is not that. They were two different ones, but I specified a default so it could run and, pick up those users sometimes, unless I overrode it. So one thing about, you can see here, I blurred out the password. It's supposed to be secured, and it is kind of. When you create a new variable, you have a default value, and that's what we were seeing right here. These are defaults. I specify this job, and I can override them when I actually schedule a job or run it manually. But you could put the default in here. Secured will not hash that though. So you will see my password wherever you go. That's the fix. Oh, that's why I blurred it out here, because you can see it. So that's if you define it as a default. So the trick to securing that is to actually do it in the job. So here is, I've created the job, and now this will give me defaults, but I can also specify my own parameters. When I put the password in here and save it, it will secure it. Now, the funny thing is, oh, we can't see it because you can't get that zoom.
I'm not sure how I do that.
I know we've been having that problem too. Okay, well, I can just go out of full screen for a moment. Escape, please. Because I have a screenshot down at the bottom that I wanted to show. Still can't see it. Can you see? Oh, yeah, I can. So it does hash it, and here's the database value. So the funny thing is, those asterisks is just the text field of asterisks. They're showing you, yeah, we hashed it. Sure. But there's the actual hash. So I went to the database to make sure that's not just a display property as stars, because we know we can tell a field, pretend it's hashed. It is actually hashed. So the other thing, I mean, it's fairly simple concept once it clicks, and the documentation about using variables, it's all there, but you have to kind of connect a few dots manually. Once I reread, after I figured this out and I read the documentation, I'm like, oh, okay. I guess I could have figured that out by reading the docs. It made more sense after the fact. So really, I kind of, in planning the session, I realized it might be kind of short because you show the variables, you show how to set it up. What else is there? So I've got some other things about Spoon and Atrium Integrator. So before we kind of move on, are there any questions about this? Because I think almost anybody I've talked to doesn't do it this way. So does anybody do it this way? Does everybody hard code their? I've been doing it that way for a decade at least. Well,
I tasked one of my developers on our LDAP job to go figure out how to use passwords to pass everything in, because we were getting told that our system account was about to go into a mode where the password was going to have to change every 60 days. I didn't want to have to redeploy this code every time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. In the original version of this LDAP import we did for the customer with the 5 jobs, the 5 transformations. I lost my train of thought. Man, I had a point to make about that. All right, moving on.
Just for the record, everybody in this room shook their heads in acknowledgement that they all hard code things. No one actually does it the way that you've described.
Okay, so I remember what I was thinking. We had the 5 jobs, we had the different OUs. My next iteration of this, before I had the aha moment, is I created a consolidated job, but I used a JavaScript step to look at some context of how it was being run, because there were some other things based on the OU. There were some other little things they would do. So I was kind of getting there, but I still hadn't figured out this piece yet. So I made my job more dynamic. It was more, it would change how it behaved based on context, but I wasn't there yet. This was my 3rd iteration when it clicked, and I go, oh, if I do it from here, because at that point I was still running it from the old Flash console. It was an Atrium Integrator job, not a data management job. It's all the same transformation, just depends on how you set it up and run it. This was the 3rd, iteration where it really clicked. And when the customer came back and said, we need to change something, I think the next request was what they wanted to populate mail stop from attribute and AD. I didn't have to update all 5 transformations, updated it once. And when I did the dev QA prod cycles, I didn't worry about my connections pointing back to the previous environment, because I'm now pulling it all from here. So that was just a lifesaver. And when Phil and I were kicking around, what topics can we have? We didn't know anybody who was doing this. So it might be kind of a short and sweet topic, but I think we all can benefit from it because it seems to be a bit of a mystery. So any questions or thoughts on getting away from hard coding the values, using how BMC designed it, but didn't make it terribly clear? Or we just didn't want to read the docs and figure it out our own way. That might be the case as well. Any questions or any, have you guys found other ways to get around hard coding or making your jobs more dynamic? Okay.
Honestly, it's been such a pain. I was moving to a direction, looking forward to innovations suite being part of it and replacing my Atrium Integrator jobs using those.
Interesting.
Because I find this so painful.
Okay, well, good. So this will make it less painful?
Perhaps.
Perhaps.
We have a lot of integrations in a lot of different environments, and so this is definitely helpful. I always schedule all my jobs in Atrium Integrator, so
yeah.
We do have stuff that we've used this for, like we go like custom import tool kind of thing, but I guess the light bulb goes off that we're using a variable for that one. I don't know why I didn't think about using this for the other.
Yep. And good point, because most of us have run these before. We've imported the spreadsheets and it's been right there in front of us, but I never put it together with my own jobs, Why am I not taking advantage of that as well? So a few other things that just through this process, because I had a few projects where I spent a lot of time for a few customers in Atrium Integrator, data management, and Spoon, which I have a love-hate relationship with Spoon too. You change one thing and you'll spend 2 hours troubleshooting that one little thing that went
Well,
wrong.
whatever error you get never makes sense anyway, since it's big, long, you have no idea really what failed.
Exactly, absolutely. And that's where I've started. I think you may have been in my session Tuesday where I showed my LDAP transformation. I have each step writes to a log file, because that way I figured I could watch the data flow and I see where, oh, I'm expecting some value there that's not there. That was more helpful a lot of times, or that was helpful a lot of the times than the logs or the error.
Yeah.
The other thing that helps is if you go into is it Kettle server, where it will show you, yeah, the job runs, or you see it in Spoon as well. But if you see the counts, you see the count drops drastically in one of the steps. You're like, okay, my data did not go there, so why? Oh, so one other thing I've learned here was, when you're working with the spreadsheets, they have all the steps. And actually, you can't literally see, so I'll jump out of full screen. I do not have a validate and promote step. I don't need it, because this is a custom remedy form. My validation's all done in there. I could have done it just like BMC does. Didn't see the need. So I just wanted to point out, you don't need all the steps. You could just add a single step to load the data in your form, and then your workflow kicks in. And if you have a promote process as part of that, it handles it just fine. So one thing that took me a little while to get used to was using a good naming convention on your steps. I think when I first started using Atrium Integrator and Spoon, I just left the names alone. It named it. I don't quite understand why I want to change it. But over time, especially in debugging and watching the flow and trying to find steps, I came up with a naming convention for my steps. And that really helps finding where things are going wrong, how it flows. I start using all incrementing numbers. So if I have a bunch of log files, I'll have log 1, log 2, log 3, because that follows the flow. And it helps my brain follow where the data is going and which log file pertains to a step. The other thing is Control F. That the find in Spoon is very powerful, and it will search through all of your transformations that you have open, and it will find metadata pieces that you don't necessarily see. And this has been very helpful for, one, finding all the server references, all the connections where you may have missed that hard-coded reference. So in this case, I looked for my variable name and I just show that I found it in these places. But when I was going through all of the steps, all the connections, and trying to find all of them, because we had so many different named ones, one transformation might be using 5 different connections. And to make sure I got them all, and after I imported into the upper level, when I knew I was stomping on my connections before I got to the variables aha moment, this was huge for finding those. I would look for the host name and realize I missed a spot, and I would do this before I ran it to make sure I had everything. And it really does point out some interesting things, some caching peak components that BMC has built in some of the CMDB steps that you never see, but this will point them out. And it's really kind of interesting, some of the things the find will show you. Back to the naming convention, here's actually an example BMC gives us out of the box where I love what they did. You can follow it in that navigation. So those are all the steps, and you can see all the CI cards. They're all grouped together. The CIDBs, the DCs. they named everything very well, at least their major pieces very well. So when you're going, okay, I'm having a problem with the monitors, and sure, you could find it in here, or you can Control F. The thing about Control F is it will open the step, but it won't take you to where it is when you do the find. But this is, you could find it here just sorting through it. So that has helped me in my debugging, and especially on a complex transformation like this. Back to the cache I'd mentioned in some of those backend metadatas, I've had two kind of variations, and I didn't fully figure out what was going wrong. I just knew it was cache. So there's two different things. Sometimes when I would update connections after importing from a lower level environment, there was still some weird connectivity going on. So you can clear that shared object cache, and that seemed to help typically. Sometimes I just had to close Spoon, and that typically would take care of it. But this has been helpful. That was my biggest, my most frequent troubleshooting step before I found clearing the object cache here. The other thing is, in a CMDB step, you can cache your values, which helps for performance. It's very handy, but I don't fully understand how it looks to update that cache. And the biggest problem I had was removing objects from the cache. So the biggest example comes to mind is I wrote a transformation from SCCM, and I only wanted to bring in CIs that were in our product catalog. If it's not in the product catalog, I don't care about it. And that cut us down from over 1 million CIs, mostly products, application products, to 100-something thousand. But what I found is, using the cache, it was fast. But as we adjusted our product catalog, if we removed some things, they were still in the cache. So I was still getting those. And it was inconsistent, because this lookup step might be caching, but my next step could be a CMDB update or something else. They have different cache files. So actually, the example was a relationship. I would get relationship errors because part of either the CI, I think the CI was missing, but the relationship was still trying to build, or I may have that backwards. But the two steps caches were out of sync. So in this case, I turned it off. I suffered a performance penalty, but I got the right data every time.
What I've done in the past, I just delete the cache.
Yes.
And that AI cache folder, and it'll recreate it.
Yep.
Especially like if I've done before, where I've made changes to the query, and then same thing, like I'm getting inconsistent data. I'm like, oh, I forgot to clear the cache. It thinks it's still there, kind of thing.
Yep, exactly. And so you're right. So to your point there, you can go here and you can clear out those cache files. And I did that, and after a while I got tired of it. And I realized this particular job was very dependent on the product catalog, and they're going to be changing that frequently. So I didn't want them to have weird things down the line. I didn't want to write any processes or do anything weird to clear the cache. I mean, we could have automated that. But in this case, that product catalog build step wasn't that intensive. I didn't see the need for the caching, so I just turned it off.
So when you say clear the cache, you're talking about disabling that flag, this is enabled cache.
Yes.
And then saving this and then going back and re-enabling the enabled cache.
No, I left it off.
You completely.
So
leave it
yes,
off.
so you can, and I had mixed results with disabling it, running it, enabling it again. I don't think I necessarily got fresh cache. So I would go and delete the files like you mentioned.
I had to physically go find the file and delete.
So, and that's where I knew the customer wasn't terribly versed in this area. I didn't want them to have to mess with it down the line. So I just turned it off. I wasn't gaining that much from the performance gain. So I wanted to go for reliability. And that is all. So any questions, comments?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Good, good.
Anyone on the Zoom call? I see Victoria is on and some other folks are on. Victoria, do you have any questions for Jason about his presentation, or any about the comments, or any comments about what he's presenting? Okay. Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much. And
Absolutely.
again, this is the real value, I think, of like minds meeting.
Yeah.
Right. And again, a lot of us are different levels of intensity. So if you want to call it on some of these things, but this is really, I think, the value for folks that have similar interests in these things to get together and find out that, you've not really suffered performance issues, left the cache disabled, and Chris is able to go and look for the files and delete the files and that kind of thing. So, all right. Thank you very much for presenting.
Sure.
Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely.